8 o'clock, so we will get started and probably have a few others join us. So thank you to everyone that has joined us for Mantech's Manufacturing Matters series. I'm Ian Wilson, Mantech's Director of Marketing and Business Development. This series was created, I guess we started at the beginning of this calendar year, created to focus on issues facing manufacturers and provide insights and takeaways. We've certainly grown the series since COVID-19 took over, and we're continuing to rotate the topics to cover the 4 categories that Mantech serves, which are sales and marketing, process improvement, manufacturing technology, and workforce engagement. Today's session is cybersecurity, be concerned or be crushed. Jason McNew is an expert in his field. He probably will give a little bio, but my knowledge, he came from Department of Defense, and he could go on and on about this topic and promises that will be done by lunchtime. I am kidding, although there is a lot to cover, and he promised, so we stretched it to the full hour for his presentation, and then we'll open it up to the Q&A. At Q&A, you can choose to turn your audio on or use the chat feature at any time. I will note that we are recording this session, and with that.
Principal security consultant of Stronghold Cybersecurity. I've been in the IT and the tech sector since the 1990s, so 20-some years. I'm an Air Force veteran. And I spent 12 years at the White House Communications Agency, and 10 of that was at Camp David. And during that time, I held a Yankee White security clearance, which is a presidential access clearance. It means that you could be in the presence of POTUS without, unescorted. So I spent a lot of years kind of working in buildings with no with no windows, surrounded by barbed wire and machine guns and that kind of stuff. I'm a certified information system security professional, which is a very widely recognized cybersecurity certificate, and I have a Master of Professional Studies from Penn State in Information Sciences, Cybersecurity, and Information Assurance, in addition to 3 other degrees beyond that. Next slide, please. So what is cybersecurity? And this is kind of a canned definition, and it's what I have on the back of my business card. So I'm going to just read this, and then I'm going to talk about it a little bit. Cybersecurity is the body of technologies, processes, and practices designed to protect computers, handheld and other internet-connected devices, networks, programs, and data from attack, damage, or unauthorized access. That's what cybersecurity is by definition. Slide. And that definition, that's all well and good, but at the end of the day, cybersecurity is about managing risk. And for most businesses, security is a cost center, and a lot of businesses view IT as a cost center as well. So security only makes sense to the extent that it reduces business risks or saves money, and we have to be able to quantify those things in order to justify what we're doing. Slide. Okay, so today we're going to talk about the NIST Cybersecurity Framework version 1.1, and this was released within the last couple of years to the public and is really starting to gain traction within the cybersecurity community and with American business in general. And the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, it's a voluntary framework which consists of standards, guidelines, and best practices to manage IT-borne business risk. And CSF is a life cycle approach. You can see it's in a circle there, which revolves around continuous improvement. And there's a link here in the slide to show. It's nist.gov/cyberframework. And the cybersecurity framework consists of 5 high-level functions, 23 categories, and then 108 subcategories, or what we call controls as cyber practitioners. Next slide. This is the basic hierarchy of the CSF framework, and it shows the functions here on the left, and then it shows you the categories slightly to the right of that, and then the informative references. And most of the informative references also come from NIST, many of them from NIST 800-53, which is about 500 pages, and then other places within the NIST common body of knowledge. But it also maps to other standards such as ISO, Center for Internet Security, and that kind of stuff, SANS, for example. Next slide, please. And here we have a list of the NIST, the 23 high-level subcategories: asset management, business environment, governance, recovery planning, so on and so forth. So I'm not going to read all of these, but we're going to get into some of these I have 23 slides where we're going to try and touch base on each one of these just a little bit. Slide. Okay. So here's the 23 categories. Now, these are colored, and it corresponds with the circle that we saw in the earlier slide. And notice how we're heavier on identify and protect, and prevention more so than others. So what NIST wants us to do is spend most of our time preventing events from happening, more so than responding and recovering. We know those things are going to happen, and we have to have processes in place to deal with an event when it does happen, or some type of a breach we have to be able to detect. But they want us spending most of our time on identify and protect. Slide. And then beyond the 5 categories, the 5 families, the 23 categories, here's the 108 subcategories, or the controls themselves. And this is something that we would put into, for example, a spreadsheet, Excel, and then answer every single one of these in detail, which is a lot of work to do all of this for a large organization, answering 108 controls. You could have a half-page response for each one of those or more. And then again, notice how the heavy bias towards event prevention. In the controls themselves, there's 29 controls for identify, and then 39 controls for protect, and then just 18 for detect, 16 for respond, and then 6 for recover. So we have those things, but we're heavily biased towards identify and protect. And again, notice the life cycle continuous improvement approach. Okay, so now we're going to get into some of the functions and the categories themselves. And the first thing we have to do is identify what we have. And when we do assessments, we normally find that most companies do not do a very good job identifying everything that they have on their network. And we bring in technology to Nessus, for example, vulnerability scanner, and we put it on the network to actively scan for what's there. And we often find significant deltas between what people think they have and what they actually do have. So as part of identify, the physical devices and systems within the organization, they have to be inventoried. Software platforms, applications, they need to be inventoried. We need to know what software and applications we have. Organizational communications and data flows need to be mapped. We need to know what kind of data is on our network. We're going to have to classify it by its level of risk to the network and how important it is to the organization. External information systems, they need to be cataloged. And when we dig into companies' networks, we often find that they have more stuff connected externally than what they realize until they actually write it down. And these could be things like, alarm vendors, video cameras, time clocks. There could be vending machines, not vending machines, but manufacturers tend to have, machines that will dispense nuts and bolts and stuff like that. And those machines are, externally connected. Printers could be externally connected. So we need to know what entities have connectivity into our network and why, and make sure that we understand any risk that's associated with that. Building access control is another example. It's not unusual to have building access control outsourced. And then all of our resources that we use towards cybersecurity, hardware, devices, data, time, personnel, and software, they're prioritized based on their business value. So we have to know what is the most important to business function, and then make sure that we're protecting appropriately. And then cybersecurity roles and responsibilities for the entire workforce. And security at one time was kind of thought as an IT function, but really security is more like safety. It's an organizational function that has to start with the C-suite on down. And ultimately somebody in the C-suite, a position of leadership, is going to be responsible for cybersecurity just as they are as safety. So in addition to identifying the leaders that are taking a responsibility for your program, you have to have a risk manager and then other cybersecurity roles. Security manager, rather. Next slide, please. In order to have a cybersecurity program that works, we need to understand what our business environment is. So that the organization's mission, objectives, the stakeholders, and all those things, they need to be understood and then prioritized. And then we use this information to build our cybersecurity program. we need to understand the organization's role in the supply chain. For example, and this is especially important with for example, with Department of Defense. You could have, one company that makes a washer that's critical to the operation of a submarine or something like that, and that's something that has to be protected. Another example of critical infrastructure would be power supplies, plants, telecommunications, those kinds of things. And then your dependencies and critical functions for delivery of critical services are established. So we need to know who else is critical to delivering our service. So we need to understand our supply chain end to end, both in terms of materials and information, and then make sure that we're protecting, that those things are understood, and then we use those to make any types of cybersecurity decisions. And then we also need to determine what are our resilience requirements. So what is our tolerance for something being down, and how available does it need to be? To what level of redundancy do we have to have in a particular system? Make sure that it's functioning at all times in order for our business to operate. And some things we're just simply going to have greater tolerance for risk than others. Slide. Cybersecurity governance. Now, depending on where you are, who you are, what you do, and then who you do it for, you might have some type of regulatory requirements. For example, HIPAA, PCI, or if you work in the DoD space, you would be subject to the CMMC, the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. So in terms of governance, we need to understand any kind of compliance requirements that we might have. And we also find that vendors and clients can also impose cybersecurity requirements on companies in order to do business with them. We'll find sometimes that a company will call us and say, well, we have a major client and they want us to do a penetration test. So we'll do that for them. Okay, slide. So the next piece under the, and we're still working on identify because there's many controls that are just under identify. So the organization understands the cybersecurity risk to organizational operations. And to that end, you need to do an organizational risk management, that includes IT, and that also includes other types of threats, whether they're insider threats, whether terrorism, acts of God nature, those types of things, pandemics, anything that could possibly affect your operations. And your asset vulnerabilities, they're identified and documented. So we're going to look at our assets, whether it's a data center or whether it's an individual computer or whether it's people, and then try to identify what types of vulnerabilities there are. Your cyber threat intelligence is received from information sharing forums and sources. So you want to subscribe to alerts from vendors, NIST, SANS, places like that, that are going to, Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh, they're going to send out these various alerts for you so that you know when there's some type of a new breach or a threat or something. Your internal and external threats need to be identified and documented. And then potential business impacts and likelihoods need to be identified. And then your risk responses are identified and prioritized. So as part of our organizational risk assessment, we need to actually have some type of responses in here as well. Slide. Again, we're still working under identify, the blue part of our cybersecurity framework version. The organization's priorities, constraints, risk tolerances, and assumptions are established and used to support operational risk decisions. So risk management processes are established. And in this case, for example, our risk management process is going to be the NIST CSF. So we're going to recommend that the company formally adopt at the executive level the NIST Cybersecurity Framework as their risk management process. And then this is going to be agreed to all the organizational stakeholders. So this is something that's going to be adopted voluntarily by a company and say, yes, we're going to follow this, and we're going to have the resources that we need to do this, and you're going to have the backing of leadership here. The organizational, as one of the things that's going to come out of an organizational risk assessment is the organization's risk tolerance has to be determined. We need to know what our tolerance for risk is cybersecurity-borne risk, and then clearly express that. And that needs to be in our organizational risk assessment. And our risk tolerance has to be informed by its role in critical infrastructure, if you're part of critical infrastructure like power supply plant or something like that, telecommunications. Supply chain risk management. This is important in the defense sector in particular. And then, for example, with the big three, Ford, Chrysler, and GM, supply chain risk management is a big deal for them. They have tons of vendors, and if some of those are very critical to their operations, and if one of these vendors were to be hacked into and then have information stolen or shut down or a ransomware attack or something like that, it could stop production of the F-150. So we are finding that big companies like that are also imposing cybersecurity requirements on their subcontractors, and this would be an example would be the NIST CSF. So your cyber supply chain risk management processes are identified, and suppliers and third-party partners of information systems and your services, those things are all going to be identified. They need to have their own cybersecurity plans in place, and then they need to have response and recovery planning and testing are conducted with suppliers and third-party providers. So all these things need to be going on. Identity management, authentication, and access control. So in most businesses, this is going to consist primarily of, for example, a Windows domain controller, and then you're building access control systems and things like that. So identities and credentials have to be issued for people, for computers, for assets, and they need to be managed, verified, revoked, and then audited for authorized and unauthorized people, devices, and processes. And these things need to be integrated with human resources and IT. For example, if somebody's going to get walked out the door, then their account needs to be disabled while that's happening. Their assets need to be collected, whatever they are. Remote access has to be revoked, and then any kind of building access tokens that they have need to be collected at that time. So all of those processes need to be integrated. So in addition to logical access tokens, username and a password, physical access to assets is going to be managed and protected. Remote access is managed. And identities need to be proofed and bound to credentials and asserted in its various interactions. And that's done, again, by, Active Directory or a building badge or something like that. Next slide. I think we skipped one. Go back one to awareness and training. This is another piece of protect. And I usually find when we do assessments, I think I would have to guess that maybe 30% of the companies that we work with doing assessments have meaningful training in place. So all of your users, they need to be informed and then trained. And then your privileged users in particular, and those are people that have administrative credentials, network and systems administrators. We need to make sure that they understand what their roles and responsibilities are. Your third-party stakeholders, again, your suppliers, customers, and partners, they need to understand their roles and responsibilities in cybersecurity. Senior executives, they need to understand their roles. And then physical and cybersecurity personnel, they understand their roles and responsibilities. In larger organizations, physical security and cybersecurity are going to be separate roles. If you have 50 or 100 buildings to deal with or something like that, then physical security is going to be its own job. And there's all sorts of paid and free resources for awareness and training available on the internet. There's a couple different vendors that sell this now. KnowBe4, which is Kevin Mitnick's company, Breach Secure Now. And then there's a bunch of free training available too. The DoD Cyber Awareness Challenge is a good one. It's about an hour long. And if you don't want to pay for training, you could have all of your employees take that one every single year and then document that. But it's very important to train people, especially on phishing, because phishing is still a common attack vector. And the reason why attackers continue to phish is because it works and because people will reliably, click on nonsense like cats or whatever it is that you jokes and stuff that you send them. So training is important. Slide. We're still under, now we're moving on, we've moved into protect here. So we're spending most of our time, again, as I said earlier, on identify and protect. Let's see how I'm doing time-wise. Okay. So your information and records and your data, they need to be managed consistently with the organization's risk strategy. And the cheaper that storage became, a lot of companies and people, they kind of developed a habit of sort of hoarding data and just hanging on to it and letting it sit around forever. And then when you have a breach, an attacker gets terabytes of stuff, and a lot of it might be, you know, junk, or it might not really matter. But the bottom line is that the volume of that data, it creates risk. So you don't want to be hanging on to more data than what you realistically need in order to perform your business function. So, and your data at rest needs to be protected. And by data at rest, something that's sitting on a hard drive in a laptop, this is a common problem. Anything that's mobile needs to have volume level encryption on it. And we still find that fairly regularly. Companies have laptops and other mobile assets that are not encrypted. And an unencrypted Windows laptop is exceedingly, any Windows machine is exceedingly easy to break into. I remember my son used to get junk computers off of Craigslist, and you know, when he was 12, he figured out how to get into the hard drive of a machine that was, you know, locked, and I didn't help him do it. I mean, it's really that easy if the hard drive's not encrypted. It's very, very important to encrypt your hard drives and mobile assets and laptops, because people lose stuff, it gets ripped off, and if they do, it's really easy to get that stuff off of there. Data in transit needs to be protected, so we need to make sure that we're using the proper encryption protocols. And some of the other older encryption protocols have been deprecated, and they're no longer considered to be secured. So for that reason, it's important to do a network audit and then see what protocols are in use. If we're using, you know, older versions of SSL or TLS or whatever, or, you know, even worse, if we're using clear text protocols to transmit data that should be protected, that's a real risk. And your assets, they're formally managed throughout removal, transfers, and disposition. So any IT asset needs to be treated kind of like a high-level asset. We need to be tracking and tracking all of that stuff through the life cycle. Protections against data leaks are implemented. So for your most critical data, we should have some type of data loss prevention. And there's a bunch of different ways to do this. It could be done at the edge through firewalls, web application filtering. It could be done at the workstation. There's a bunch of different endpoint protection suites that are doing this. We need to keep our development and then testing environments separate from the production environment as well. If we're developing software or developing websites or web applications or firmware or anything like that, we need to have a separate test and production environment, because testing things often has unintended consequences and blows stuff up. So we need to have separate environments for those. Slide. Information protection processes and procedures. So our security policies that address scope, roles, responsibilities, management commitment, procedures, these things are all maintained and then used to manage the protection of information systems and assets. So to that end, a baseline configuration of information technology and industrial control systems is created, and then maintained using incorporating security principles. And this is, for small companies, this can be a difficult thing to do. So larger companies are going to use images that they've built in-house so that all the machines have the same baseline image on it. But we need to make sure that your machines have a baseline operating system, a baseline of software that's allowed on them, a baseline of some type of hardening, whether it's based on the CIS, Center for Internet Security, or the DoD STIGs or something like that. And the purpose of this is to ensure some type of security uniformity across your network. You wouldn't buy, machines from Dell and then HP and then Apple or whatever, and then just put them on your network. These things, they need to all be configured in this similar type of way. And the same thing is true for routers and switches and security appliances. you need to have some type of a standard operating procedure to, configure all these things. Otherwise, it's going to get done kind of in an ad hoc manner, which is something we don't want. We need to have a system development life cycle to manage your system. So some companies will say, 5 years for laptops and then 6 years for desktops and then, 3 years for servers or something like that. Or when something's out of warranty, we'll have a 5-year warranty on it. In some cases, they'll lease them. But we don't want to wind up in a situation where we have critical services running off of a 10-year-old server because the thing, it could fail. And then at some point, we might find that there's unpatchable vulnerabilities or something on it. So it's important to manage the life cycle of not only hardware, but also software on your network. Just as, for example, a cab company would manage the life cycle of a taxi cab. I mean, there's only so much useful life that's in a taxi cab or a truck, and we have to have a plan in place to replace those things as, capital expenditures when they reach the end of their useful life cycle. And the same thing is true of computing assets. We don't want to wait for these things to croak before we get rid of them. Backups of information are conducted, maintained, and tested. Backing up is very important, and then testing the backup is important because attackers have been known to deliberately corrupt backups and then wait 2 or 3 months and then come back and then do a ransomware attack, and then they try to do backup and they find out that they were backing up garbage and now they're dead and they have to pay for that. So they're extremely clever. So there is no such thing as set it and forget it for backups. Backups have to be tested routinely, at least weekly is best. And I mentioned this earlier, data needs to be destroyed according to policy. If you don't need data, don't let it sit around. Have some type of a policy for destroying old unused data. If you don't need it, get rid of it because it creates risk that you don't want to deal with. Your protection processes need to be improved. Again, this is a cycle. A system development lifecycle-based approach to security, so we need to be continuously improving it. The effect of protective technologies want to be shared. Response plans need to be shared. Response and recovery plans are going to be tested. And the cybersecurity, and I mentioned this earlier, cybersecurity is included in human resources practices as far as screening people, deprovisioning credentials, and those sorts of things. And in a mature organization these days, if somebody is going to, lose their job or get moved for whatever their reason, the first people to find out about it, unfortunately, are IT. Because if human resources is going to, walk somebody out the door at noon, then IT is going to revoke their system access at 11:55. It's an unpleasant side effect of being in IT. We also need to have a vulnerability management plan developed and implemented. And when we do network scans, it's not unusual for us to find hundreds or in some cases thousands of vulnerabilities on a network. And, they're going to be criticals, CVSS criticals and highs. And a lot of companies don't have any kind of a plan to deal with that. And the bigger the network is, the harder that is to deal with. And there's formal vulnerability management systems available that you could bring in from companies like Tenable and that sort of thing in order to do that. There's a lot under this particular. There's a bunch of subcategories under this particular, bunch of controls under this particular family here. Maintenance. Next slide, please. Maintenance. We need maintenance and repairs of industrial control and information systems that are performed consistent with policies and procedures. And in most cases, you're going to defer to the manufacturer on what they think the reasonable life cycle for something is. And we need to maintain these things. It's important to check them and make sure that they're cooling properly or not, covered with dust and crud and those types of things, and that they're physically serviceable. So these maintenance and repair of organizational assets, it's performed, and we need to log these things, and then it needs to be done with approved and controlled tools. IT people are pretty creative, and if you don't control what they're using or pay attention to it, then they're going to download whatever tool makes their job the easiest to do. And we need to make sure that the tools are not introducing any type of risk into our system. So make sure that the tools we're using for maintenance are going to be approved ones and not some type of, shareware or freeware or something like that that could contain some type of malicious logic. So we need to control our maintenance. And then remote maintenance, again, I had mentioned this earlier, anything on your network to be connected to by a third party for maintenance, whether it's building access control systems, video cameras, industrial control systems, whatever it is, we need to make sure that's approved, logged, and then performed in such a way that prevents unauthorized access. And a prime example of this, not to beat a dead horse on it, is Target, right? The Target breach was ultimately caused by an HVAC vendor that had some type of an unpatched hole or a vulnerability or something like that. So those types of things are very, very important. That third-party access is critical. That stuff all needs to be in your system security plan. Every single one of those needs to be documented. Slide. Protective technology. So this is the last part of protect, and this one is really important. And this is another one that I find when we do our vulnerability assessments that most companies tend to fall short on. I tend to find that most companies are kind of stuck in the 90s security model of security, which is to say they have some type of automated patching in place, they have antivirus in place, and then they have a firewall in place, and that's kind of about it. And it's really not enough. We need to have a UTM solution in place, Unified Threat Management, which and I could compare UTM to an AWAC plane. If you remember what that is, it's one of those passenger type looking aircraft, a Boeing, that has the disc on top of it that rotates and flies over a battlefield. And it looks at the battlefield, and you see, tanks and soldiers and planes and all these other things kind of moving around. It's battlefield management. So it gives you an overarching view of the battlefield is what UTM does. And it does this a couple different ways by ingesting audit logs from the different machines. The things on your network are going to create audit logs of different events, people logging in, people logging out, changing passwords, those kinds of things. Routers and switches do this. All of your security things do this. And the amount of logs that they generate is just enormous, and it's unmanageable. It's not something that you can look at. So we want to ingest all of these logs into something that's called a SIEM, a Security Information and Event Monitoring Tool, right? So we're going to take logs from workstations, servers, routers, switches, whatever else is important, and then ingest it into a SIEM and then create alerts. So if we have an employee that was fired a month ago logging into your machines at 2 o'clock in the morning or something like that, obviously that's something I want to know about. Or somebody's changing passwords at 2 o'clock in the morning on Christmas, that's something I want to know about. That shouldn't be happening. And a SIEM is one of those things that is going to do that for you. We also need a vulnerability scanner on the network. We want to scan the network at a minimum, really once a month is kind of the minimum you want to do that. Really ideally once a week. And on highly classified systems, secret systems, we would do it daily. So if something connects to the network that doesn't belong there, or there's a new vulnerability that we don't know about, a network vulnerability scanner such as Nessus or OpenVAS or Qualys, there's a couple of them out there, is going to find that. And it's unbelievable what Nessus will find on your network and then identify it. Nessus has 100,000 plugins. And when I connect that to a network and then scan, the results are always interesting. We find all kinds of old stuff that they didn't know was connected, tons of unpatched vulnerabilities. We find that the networks are flat and there's no segmentation, all kinds of stuff. And then other things in terms of protective technology, removable media needs to be protected and then restricted according to policy. And by removable media, we mean things like USB drives and CD-ROMs. Optical media is getting to be less and less of a problem because it's falling out of favor and we don't see it as much anymore. But a lot of companies don't control removable media, and it's just too easy for somebody to put something on a thumb drive or whatever and then walk out the door with it. A thumb drive is teeny tiny. So if thumb drives, ideally, unless thumb drives are required for business purposes, then turn them off. Disable them using AV or GPOs or whatever you need to so that they don't work at all. And then anything that is going to be used for business purposes needs to be issued by the company And then one good way to track them is have them all the same, silk screen them, tag them, something like that. So you might only have 10 or 20 that are authorized for use. They're going to be issued to people the same way that building keys would be, like physical keys. They should be really kind of tracked as a high value asset. And then depending on the type of data that's put on them and what you're doing with them, if you're carrying outside the building, they should be encrypted. There's some that have the ability to physically encrypt themselves, or you can encrypt the payload using BitLocker or something like that. We need to incorporate the principle of least functionality into everything. So your information systems should only be doing what you need them to do to support business purposes. So we don't want to scan machines and then find Spotify and then iTunes and Candy Crush and other nonsense on those. Because you're introducing unneeded risk into the system. So this is a form of attack surface reduction. And this is the same reason why a soldier lies down in a field, right? Because he's reducing his attack surface. And you want to do the same thing with your systems. The less you have on them, the better in terms of security, because it's just less attack surface. So that's what we mean when we say principle of least functionality. Okay, next slide. Anomalies and events. Now we're into detection, and we have 3 categories under detection. Anomalous activity is detected and the potential impact of events is understood. And again, this is something that the more advanced technologies like UTM are going to do for you. Let's say, for example, that somebody is scanning your network at 2 o'clock in the morning, right? That shouldn't be happening. And the way that could happen, somebody clicks on a phishing email, they get a backdoor installed in the machine, and then they install tools on the machine to do reconnaissance. So when you're not there, it's scanning the network. And if you don't have something, IDS, intrusion detection, network intrusion detection, to scan that, to pick that type of activity up, you're just not going to know that. So that's going to be something we describe as anomalous activity. Or, for example, a massive spike in outbound traffic at 2 o'clock in the morning could be an example of exfiltration, somebody stealing files. So we need to detect anomalous activity and then understand what the potential impact of those. And again, a UTM will do these things first. It's going to establish a baseline of network operations and expect the data flow so we have an idea what to expect. And then any type of events that are detected, they need to be analyzed so that we understand those things. So alerts are going to need to go out to a SOC, a Security Operations Center, or your IT team or whoever. And there's all kinds of companies that offer this type of stuff as a service where they'll bring in a UTM for you, put on the network, and then they monitor it using their SOC. And this is done, by placing sensors on the network. And if you have multiple locations, we're going to put sensors in the locations. We could put sensors in the cloud. And the sensors are going to pick up data from all these different places, and then it's going to fuse it and then aggregate it, and then it's going to create actionable intelligence, like I had mentioned before with the AWAC plane. A 707 passenger type aircraft with a disc on top, it's collecting intelligence and then providing actionable intelligence to battlefield commanders. That's what a UTM does. And most networks don't have anything like that. And for any kind of advanced protection in today's world, these things are required. And the DoD is requiring these protective technologies for all of the manufacturers now under the NIST 800-171 framework. They need to have SIEM, security information, event monitoring, vulnerability scanning, IDS. And I always recommend we wrap those things into a unified threat management solution such as Alien Vault or NetWatcher or something like that. There's a bunch of them on the market. They're not exactly cheap, but they're very, very effective at protecting a network, and it goes way beyond just having a firewall, endpoint protection, automatic patching. Those things are not good enough to keep attackers out of your network in today's world. The impact of any type of events, we need to determine what the impact is. And then we also need to fine-tune this stuff. We need to establish incident alert thresholds. Because if you don't fine-tune your protective technology, it's going to bombard your IT and your security team with alerts, and then they're going to, eyes are going to kind of glaze over. So we need to make sure that anything they're being alerted of, if somebody's receiving an alert at 2 o'clock in the morning, on Saturday, really needs to be for something that really needs their attention. Otherwise, you're going to burn your people out, and then your security is going to become less effective. So once we get this technology on the network and we start establishing a baseline and then tuning it, actually takes a couple of months to get a UTM working properly. A couple of weeks to a couple of months. Slide. Security continuous monitoring. So the network is monitored to detect potential cybersecurity events. So, and I've mentioned this a couple of times already, but what we're talking about here is network intrusion detection, host intrusion detection. Most businesses are going to have physical security. So let's say that somebody is inside the building walking around at 2 o'clock in the morning. They hid in a box or something like that. And then they waited for everybody to leave, and they got up and they're walking around. Motion detectors are going to pick that up. That's intrusion detection. Or they break a window. It's intrusion detection, and it's going to notify somebody that this is happening, right? It's going to send out an alert to ADT or the police or whoever. And most companies don't have a similar capacity on their network, and they really should. If somebody is scanning the network or changing passwords at 2 o'clock in the morning, that's interesting events that we need to know about. And it's going to be intrusion detection that is going to tell us this. So your network is monitored to detect potential cybersecurity events. The physical environment, again, is monitored to detect potential cybersecurity events. Typically, your critical servers are going to be in a server room or a server closet or something like that. And those things usually have some type of extra protection on them, and they're locked down and then restricted to a certain number of people. And if somebody is in there and doesn't belong in there, then we need to receive an alert from that. Your personnel activity needs to be monitored to detect potential cybersecurity events. So we need to know what people are doing on their machines. And again, those things are going to happen with your SIEM, your security information event monitoring. It's going to tell you if people are doing things they shouldn't be. Web application filtering can tell you if they're visiting websites that might be dangerous. Unauthorized mobile code needs to be detected, and we can do this with a vulnerability scanner. And by on mobile code, what we mean are things like Java and Flash and something like those sorts of things. And mobile code is code that downloads to your machine and then executes on your machine. It doesn't execute remotely. And most people know, in the IT community know, that Java is it's just a constant headache. So anything that falls under this category, I always recommend to get rid of it unless you actually need it for business purposes. If you don't need Java and Flash, just don't install them, because they're, in terms of security, they're a constant headache and they're a very common attack vector. External service provider activity needs to be monitored. So, for example, like I said, with building access control systems or HVAC with Target, we need to know what these people are doing, and we need to restrict their access to our network, pay attention to what they're doing. We need to monitor for unauthorized personnel connections, devices, and then software. There's a bunch of different ways to do this. So if a machine connects to the network, somebody plugs something into a port that doesn't belong there, somebody logs in, unauthorized accounts are logging into systems, that kind of thing. And then again, vulnerability scans need to be performed. PCI calls for vulnerability scanning quarterly, which is odd because it's just not effective. If you look at, for example, Microsoft's patch cycle, I always recommend that customers scan at least once a month after Patch Tuesday, after Microsoft's Patch Tuesday. Better yet would be, once a week is a reasonable time frame to scan stuff, because new exploits are just being discovered all the time. So we're going to scan on a regular basis. That's part of the detection. Slide. This function says detection processes and procedures are maintained and tested to assure awareness of anomalous events. So the roles and responsibilities for detection are well defined to ensure accountability. You don't want to just buy a license for Nessus or bring in Qualys or get Alien Vault or whatever and then install it in the network and then walk away from it. Somebody has to be responsible for care and feeding of whatever that is. And then we need to have some, standard operating procedures that are written for monitoring it. And then we need to know they need to have daily and then weekly tasks that they're doing with these things. And then we need to test it, test the detection processes. So one way to do this, if you have IDS running on the network, you would take another scanner like Nmap or something like that, and then start scanning the network from another computer. Your Alien Vault or Qualys or whatever you have should pick that type of activity up, so you want to test it. And then any type of detection that comes up, that it needs to be communicated based on its criticality. So if your technology picks up something and needs to communicate to your IT or your security folks, and if it's something that's bad enough, you might even be, up channeling that to the executives or whatever. And your detection processes need to be continuously improved. IT just changes constantly. Attackers change constantly. So again, that's why the CSF is a life cycle type approach. We want to continuously improve our detection processes. Slide. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, we spent the vast majority of our time on recover and identify. And the CSF, this is very high level what we're doing here. You could easily write a semester college level course around this easily. So we're kind of going through the 23 families at a kind of a 30,000 foot view. And recover and identify is most of it, and then protect has a portion of it, and then detect and then respond are a lot smaller. So we're finishing up with the CSF here, and then we have a couple more slides after this. So you have to have an incident response plan because we know that incidents are going to happen, right? IT and cybersecurity practitioners, we consider networks to fall into two categories nowadays: those that have been breached and those that are going to get breached. That's just kind of a fact of life anymore. Eventually, attackers, and especially your state-sponsored ones, they troll the internet 24/7, 365, looking for open ports and things to attack on insecure protocols, and they use automated bots to do this. They're like, whales patrolling the ocean, vacuuming up krill. They just swim and swim and swim and then eat the krill, and they do it 24/7, 365. And that's, so if you have an unsecure service out there, they're going to find it eventually, and then they're going to exploit it. It's just a matter of time. So we need to have an incident response plan. Then our response processes and procedures, as part of our system security plan, they need to be executed and maintained. So we want to make sure that we're updating those things on a regular basis. And your response plan, when you have an incident, your response plan, you need to actually execute it. And it's just going to be just like a safety incident. If somebody cuts themselves, they go to the safety manager and then they fill out paperwork, and then you have an incident there that they have to fill out. And the same thing needs to happen if somebody gets a virus on their computer or something like that, or somebody does something, dumb or unauthorized. We need to make sure that we're capturing that. And then the response plan needs to be both executed during and then after an incident. And we're going to, depending on the type of incident, we're going to update the response after the fact based on what we've learned. Slide. So we have an incident, and then our response activities. An incident could be somebody clicked on a phishing email, or we have ransomware or something like that. And then your response activities need to be, coordinated with internal and external stakeholders. So if your users need to be trained, you have some type of event, they're going to go get the security manager, whoever that is, in their department or for the entire company, depending on the size. And the security manager is going to have an incident response checklist, and they're going to respond. And you're going to go to the machine and then start filling that out. And then based on what they're observing, they're going to know who they need to call. So these activities are coordinated with both the internal and external stakeholders. So the personnel, everybody that's involved, they need to know their role and their order of operations when a response is needed. You have the user who identifies it. You have the security manager, and the security manager is going to notify IT or security people, or they're going to, and then up channel to the C-suite executives or whoever needs to know. And the incidents, they need to be reported in a way that's consistent with established criteria. And depending on the type of breach, if you suspect exfiltration, depending on the state or the type of data, you might have some type of notification requirements if it's personally identifying information or PII or something like that. Or you might have contractual requirements based on who you're doing business with. And then also, voluntary information sharing should occur with external stakeholders. So if you have an incident and it's something that's novel, let's say that it appears to you to be brand new, which happens sometimes. You might have a brand new type of infection or something like that. Then you want to try and get a sample of that piece of logic and then, communicate that to CERT or whoever. We have what we believe is a brand new type of infection or malicious logic or a new attack vector that we haven't seen or read about anywhere. And, we want to share that with the cybersecurity community. Slide. Okay, so analysis needs to be conducted to ensure the effective response and support recovery activities. So the notifications from your detection systems that you have, your UTM and your SIEM, those things need to be investigated. And again, that's why it's important to set thresholds. You don't want your security people getting alerts for nonsense, but you do want them getting alerts for things that are important. Again, like I said, if somebody's scanning your network in the middle of the night, that's something that would need to be investigated. So they need to receive the alert and then they need to go respond to that and then figure out what's going on. And then the impact of whatever's happening needs to be understood. Okay, somebody's scanning the network at 2 o'clock in the morning, or somebody is creating administrator accounts on the domain controller at 2 o'clock in the morning. Those are things, that are fairly egregious that would need to be understood. And then depending on the type of incident, we might want to do some type of forensics. In the military, incident response involves, or in most organizations, a mature incident response would, responding to a user, would unplug their computer from the network or disconnect it from Wi-Fi, and then we would take it and then do forensics on it without shutting it off, because you could have stuff sitting in memory or whatever. You don't want to turn a computer off if you find something going on with it that shouldn't be, but you do want to disconnect it from the network so that we could take it and then do forensics. And it just, whether we do forensics or not depends on a variety of things. It depends on its operational impact, its cost, how important the data is. And it's not always reasonable to do that. If somebody just, gets some type of drive-by malware on a machine because they're on some website doing something they shouldn't have been and they got some piece of garbageware on their computer, forensics might not be the right answer. That would be a nuke and pave type of situation where we just format the machine and then reload it and then reinstall it. But if we find that we have a very sophisticated backdoor from an advanced persistent threat on a machine, then that's a little bit different. We might want to take an image of the hard drive and then explore that a little bit more closely and then see what's going on. And incidents, they need to be categorized in a manner that's consistent with response plans. You could have minor incidents, critical incidents, depending on how bad the infection or incident is, or what it got into. And we need to have processes to receive, analyze, and then respond to these types of things. And those are all going to be part of a written incident response plan. And companies like Stronghold, we specialize in those types of things, helping you with an incident response plan. Slide. Mitigation, and the mitigation is basically cleanup, right? This would be like you knocked a jar of mayonnaise onto the floor at Walmart. You got to go clean it up, right? So whatever it is you have going on, you could have an infection on one machine or 10 machines or 100 machines or 1,000 machines. It could be in your server farm. It could be anywhere. So once we figure out everything once we figure out everything that's infected, we need to perform some type of activities to prevent the expansion of the event. We want to make sure it doesn't get worse. And as I mentioned before, a simple form of mitigation would be somebody has malware on their machine, right? So the first thing we do is we unplug it from the network, and that's going to prevent it from spreading to other machines if they're trying to move laterally through the network. So we need to determine what exactly is the scope of the infection, what is it infecting, and then, put a wall around that and then contain it by disconnecting computers from the network, or removing routing statements, or putting in access control lists, disabling machines, or, whatever you need to do. You might just shut off a switch. That would instantly disconnect a bunch of computers from the network, and that's if something's bad enough, that would be a reasonable thing to do. Shut off the access layer switches would be a form of mitigation, and that would, help to prevent. That would help to contain the event. And then beyond that, again, we need to, begin cleaning it up as part of our mitigation. Once we've determined what's infected, what's going on, and then we've determined, how bad the infection is and how widespread it is, then we need to do mitigation, which is, can we remove the malicious logic and be sure that it's gone? Can we re-image the machines or something like that? And sometimes mitigation could get to be extremely large effort. And this stuff doesn't normally make the news, but it's happened at major defense contractors where you have highly advanced, state-backed, advanced persistent threat type actors get into a network, and they have, how are we doing on time? We're at 9:01, so I don't want to, I'll try and get this done up here, but I've heard of mitigation involving thousands of machines, which is extremely expensive to do because the infection is just so bad they don't know how to get rid of it. So the only thing I do is nuke and pave. Response improvements. So whenever we have an incident, we want to do an after action review and then take a look at what happened and then see how we could improve our response to that. Go back and, okay, what did we learn from the incident? And then take a look at our incident response plan and our lessons learned, and then go back and then update the incident response plan based on what happened. If we had a massive infection that spread to, 100 machines, we would probably learn something from that. So we'd want to update our IRP based on that, our incident response plan. Slide. So the recovery plan, we need to make sure that it, when something is going on, we need to make sure that we actually get out the recovery plan and then follow it. So following an incident, we're going to have a recovery plan based on the type of incident. What exactly happened? Was it an infection? Did we have a break into a building? Was it, ransomware, crypto locker, phishing, those types of things? So we need to have some type of a plan, whether it's, removing malicious logic or training users, or re-imaging machines, reloading stuff. So we want to have a written recovery plan that's actually executed after the cybersecurity event. And for smaller companies, in most cases, you're just going to have to kind of do a nuke and pave, just re-image the machine and then reload it, because forensics and these other things are too expensive. Slide. Recovery improvements. So, and again, as this is a cycle, the cybersecurity framework is a cycle. We want to make sure that we're continuously improving everything. Your recovery plan needs to incorporate lessons learned. Again, so after we do recovery, if you have to re-image 100 machines in a weekend, and I've had to do that kind of thing in the military, and it's not fun, you're going to learn something about how to do it faster and better. So you want to update your recovery plans based on an incident. Make sure you're always updating your paperwork, your recovery plan. Slide. Recovery communications. So one of the things that they mention here is public relations. And if you're in a bigger company, again, like Target, not to pick on them, but bigger companies are almost certainly going to have some type of a breach at some point. The bigger you are, the more likely it is to happen. Because you just have a bigger footprint. You're more attractive target. So your public relations people should have some type of a framework to follow, a template to follow in the event that they need to manage public relations after a breach. We want to work on repairing our reputation after a breach. Look at, Target, their stock took a hit. And that happens all the time. Companies have a breach. And even security companies have now. I mean, Zoom just had one. They're having some security issues that they patched. We're using Zoom now. They fixed it. And you just kind of take your punches and then roll on. So it's important to be upfront about this stuff. And do the exact opposite of what Experian did. Experian was not as forthcoming as they should have been about what was going on during that breach and that exfiltration they had a couple of years ago. That was managed very badly. So when you're recovering from an incident, communicating it is very important. This control applies more to larger companies than small companies, but it's also very important. Slide. So That is a whole lot of stuff that we just kind of went through in an hour. And like I said, I could easily write a semester course based on that. So the question is where do I even start? How do I do this? And the Department of Homeland Security last year, they released something called the CSET, which is the Cybersecurity Evaluation Tool. And it's free, and it has all of these controls in it. And you could create graphs, and you could click yes, no, partial, and then explain your answers and all this stuff. And it's a really good resource. And if you have a pretty strong IT team, you could download the CSET and then pick one of these frameworks, whether it's the NIST CSF or it's 800-171, which is for the DoD, or PCI, I think, and there's a bunch of other ones in there as well. And then you could have them start going through all the controls and answering them, and it'll give you an idea where you stand against the CSF. And it supports multiple security frameworks and multiple business verticals, so not just manufacturing or energy or anything like that. And the CSET is free, and it's freely available on GitHub. Slide. This is what the cybersecurity evaluation tool looks like. It's browser based. It's pretty easy to use. Slide. I have a couple of, I've kind of run past my time here, and I have a couple of slides here about how to choose qualified cybersecurity pros. So I'm kind of going to just touch on this real high level, and then we'll move on to the last slide for questions. And one of the things that makes IT and cybersecurity practitioners different than other career fields is that you need a government-issued certificate to open a nail salon or do tattoos or do taxes or be an accountant or be a teacher or to sell pizza or whatever. There is no government licensing for cybersecurity practitioners at all, right? So at the end of the day, it's really up to the consumers and the businesses to choose their qualified cyber practitioners. And I say this jokingly, but from a legal perspective, there would be nothing to stop Supercuts from selling cybersecurity. They could do that. I can't cut hair legally because I don't have a license, but Supercuts could provide cybersecurity if they wanted to. So it's important. You have to vet the practitioners on your own. And there's a lot of IT companies that are kind of like getting into security that don't really, have the right people in place. The people that have, the certifications, the experience, these things, cost a lot of money. So it's up to you. It's up to you as a consumer to make sure that the people that are working for you are qualified to do their job. Slide. 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 And then here's a quick example of how this is how the DoD does this. They have 3 different levels: information assurance level, technician 1, 2, and 3, and these are basically a junior, journeyman, and then a senior information assurance technician, and they're mapped to different industry certifications, whether it's the CISSP or the CISM, and then on the low end you have A+ security and CCNA security. So for people that you're hiring to do cybersecurity, whether it's a contractor or a company like mine or internally, take a look at this stuff and then ask them what they have. These certifications are important. And it's not just a certification, years of experience, and then, college degrees and those kinds of things are important as well. Go ahead and advance to the end, and then we'll go to questions if anybody has any.
Thanks, Jason. All right, one just popped up. What would you recommend for an extremely small business that does occasional work with customers that may require cybersecurity requirements? The cost of setting up this type of security is very expensive. No IT personnel is in-house to be able to monitor.
Okay. I missed a little bit of that. Can you reread it, please? I apologize.
What would you recommend for an extremely small business that does occasional work with customers that may require cybersecurity requirements, that they don't have someone in-house?
You need to find a competent managed service provider that can do that stuff for you. And there's a bunch of managed service providers out there, and not all of them are qualified to do this work. And I've seen some that are just not qualified that are doing terrible work. And again, like I said, they're not licensed or anything like that. So in a case like that, I would find a managed service provider to do that for you and then maintain those secure systems. I
Is
have a
all of
couple
it-
of partners. If
Is all of it going to be expensive? That was the other part that they mentioned, that they're a small business
security is
expensive.
it's never cheap. It's never cheap or easy, you know. So at the end of the day, it's going to be a business driven decision. You know, do I want to do this business or not? And I've seen this happen where I've had companies come to me and say, well, the Department of Defense wants me to, you know, comply with this framework. And I always ask them, how much of your business is DoD? And if they tell me 5% or it's 6%, then I'll ask them, well, you need to decide whether you want to keep the DoD's business or not. You know what I mean? So it's going to be a business driven decision. But if it's business you can't afford to lose it, you need to find some way to satisfy them. But, you know, somebody like me, we're experts at, you know, meeting these compliance requirements without going crazy. You know what I mean? Everything is about walking that fine line and making sure that we're doing the right thing, but not overspending or, you know, with too much operational impact or anything like that. But there's nothing about cybersecurity that's cheap, especially the talent. People that know how to do this are very expensive.
Is there a timeline set for those that are doing DoD work of when they must have it in place? Or is that past?
Yes. Oh, we're past it. The deadline for NIST 800-171 itself was at the end of 2017. And so that's, you know, over 2 years ago now. So anybody that is doing DoD work and relies on it for business, you know, if it's, you know, 20% or you can't afford to lose it, you need to comply or you're going to lose it eventually. And they're in the process of standing up what's called the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, where they're going to send somebody to your place of business. They're going to inspect your system security plan. They're going to check your controls, and then you're going to get a go, no go. And they expect that capability to be stood up by the end of this year.
Is that going to look like an OSHA audit type thing then? Or
yes, that's a very good analogy, OSHA or ISO. Yeah, but Bubba's coming to your place of business with a clipboard. Yes.
And that applies down the supply chain, that if they aren't the OEM, but they could be in the...
If you are anywhere in the DoD supply chain, and my understanding of that problem is that there are about 300,000 companies in the defense industrial base, all in, including the teeny tiny ones, and only about 25 to 30% of them have complied with that or tried to comply. So there's still a lot of them out there that have not. So if you're, you know, a couple levels down in the supply chain and the prime contractors haven't gotten to you yet, they definitely will. So if you're doing any kind of DoD work and you haven't done this yet, then you definitely need to start moving towards the light before you get just really, really caught behind the curve, and then you're in trouble. Don't let that happen.
So the very first step is have an audit done of what you have, or?
The very first step is to do an assessment.
Okay.
And I mean, you know, I spend most of my time doing that stuff for the DoD. Not for the DoD, but for DoD contractors. It's probably about 85% of my business is doing NIST work with DoD contractors. And then there's 110 controls in NIST 800-171, and then there's 20 additional enhancements in the CMMC version 1.0. So there's 130 controls total. So we come in and then we, you know, go over every single one of those controls, and then we write a response to them. You know, meeting yes, meeting no, partially meeting. And then if no, then we're going to write a POAM, a plan of action and milestones that says what we need to do to get there. And that's the first step, is to have a system security plan. Because if you don't have a system security plan, then it's instant fail. They won't even inspect you. They just fail you right off the bat. So we do the assessment, write a system security plan, and then they're going to have their plan of action and milestones after that, which says, how do I get from where I am today to, you know, where I need to be to comply. And one of the things that I was going over in the CSF was kind of harping on that protected technology a lot, because I find that most companies that I work with, I would say 75% of the assessments that I do don't have any of that stuff. Even some of the big ones. I've worked with billion-dollar companies that don't have that. It's kind of surprises me.
Is there a specific framework geared for small to mid-sized manufacturing environments? With a small piece of business, it being ITAR controlled, would it be available on the DHS CSET. I'm sure there's a special way to say that.
Yes, they're in there. Those things are in the CSET tool. And again, I mean, if you're doing ITAR work, I believe that means you're doing DoD work. I would guess. So you would fall under NIST 800-171. But those frameworks, yeah, they're in the CSET. So if you have no idea where to start, download the CSET and then start looking at the different frameworks in there, whether it's the CSF or NIST 800-171. They are in there, both of them.
Is there something different for small size versus a big manufacturer? Or is it the same regardless?
Well, that's what the CMMs, are we talking about DoD or are we just talking in more general terms?
Well, same question. I just wasn't sure if the small mid-sized manufacturing environment was different than a large manufacturing environment.
Yeah, this is Scott. Can I jump in real quick? I know that there's quite a few. The audience is in different areas here between defense and non-defense. So Jason, what I want to ask is, as a small manufacturer who isn't doing any defense work, let's say, how should they be looking at this? I mean, again, we've talked a lot about defense and the certifications and in NIST 800-171. Should they be looking at this in the same light, or do they need to be looking at this differently?
NIST 800-171 was designed for manufacturers specifically, and there's a lot of flexibility in the framework, and there's certain things where there's a standard of reasonableness for a particular control. And I'll give you an example. One of the controls talks about separation of duties, right? And in a big company, you would have separate network people, separate systems people, separate help desk people. But if you're a tiny company with one person, then it's not reasonable to have separation of duties. So we just say that in the system security plan. We have one IT person, not reasonable to have, separation of duties. So there's a lot of flexibility in NIST 800-171 for the size of the company. They really did a very good job doing best that they could, one size fits all. So really, any manufacturer could take NIST 800-171, and if you're not DoD, then take the framework and then start on it, and then kind of do best effort, and then pick what you think is the most important, and then follow it. But 800-171, I've used it for tiny companies with 3 people, and I've used it for companies with 3,000 people or 30,000 people. It does have that flexibility in it. I would recommend 800-171 for any manufacturer, certainly. But if you're a small manufacturer and you're not DoD, you might take a look at a couple of the controls and say, well, we're just going to make the choice to not do this and then accept the risk. But at least then you're aware of the risk. You say, oh, we should have this, but we don't. But at least we're aware of it. So I would use 800-171. It has that flexibility in it for any manufacturer.
Okay, so at that point, any manufacturer, again, if you're not a defense manufacturer, you're starting off almost saying you're at 100% risk, but you can start picking areas and starting to reduce that risk, though you may not mitigate 100% of the all the risk, but at least you're going in the right direction, and you have basically a game plan to be able to use.
Yeah, because it'll help you quantify the risk. Firstly, let's quantify our risk, and then we could work towards, systematically reducing that risk in a way that makes business sense and doesn't kill us on cost, right? So let's say you're, a small manufacturer, you don't work for the DoD, but you're making some type of fancy widget that might be, make a nice target for the People's Liberation Army. They want to, steal it, right? Some type of medical tech, I don't know, anything. So you could have your IT team or your security people or whoever download the CSET and then open up 800-171 and then start following it as a framework. And you could say, well, our goal is to be, to roll this out within 18 months or 24 months or something. But, it's like the old, saying Confucius, the journey of a million miles begins with the first step. Or, my grandfather used to say, you got to get up on the roof and then pound the first nail. It's the same thing. So you get up on the roof and pound the first nail would be to download the CSET and then read the thing. You got to start somewhere, because this stuff is daunting. It's definitely daunting.
Great. I have just kind of a fun question. You mentioned 2 o'clock in the morning, all of this happens. Is that true, or does it happen during daylight hours as well?
Yes, it definitely happens because, you know, one of the funny things about that we've learned over time is that a lot of the threat actors were working during regular hours, right? Which is to say that their hours, you know, began and then ended at a regular time. And what they eventually figured out was the PLA, the People's Liberation Army. These people, that's their job, to go to work, sit at a desk and hack stuff, right? And they work shifts. So the activity would just pick up during certain times, you know? But it's not unusual for them to target their attacks based on time. I just saw one of those a couple of weeks ago. A company called me. It was a newspaper where they got in and they crypto locked everything. And they waited till Friday afternoon at like 6 o'clock to do it. You know what I mean? Because that's the worst time to do it. There's nobody to respond to it. And if you need to call up somebody to do incident response during that time, it's $1 zillion. You call, you know, a company that does incident response at 7 o'clock on Friday, they'll like, sure, we'll come out. It's only $500 an hour, you know? So yeah, they do work around time frames with their targets. They're very sophisticated. Some of the stuff that they do is, it's amazing, you know, how sophisticated they are, because they're, you know, they're primarily being motivated by money, you know, so they'll work out of, you know, one jurisdiction. Like you could be, you know, set up shop in Estonia. And if you're only targeting Americans or you're only targeting Japan or something like that, the local authorities have enough other problems to deal with. They're not going to be looking for you. They really don't care, you know, as long as you're not attacking other Estonians. So they take advantage of that jurisdiction. And then they know that the FBI is not going to do anything unless their attacks exceed a certain threshold. So they take advantage of jurisdiction. They take advantage of time zones. They take advantage of regulations, language barriers, all kinds of stuff. It's crazy. I mean, they're very sophisticated, and they're not dumb. You know, they exist to make money, and sometimes they'll spend money and hire real talent to do this stuff.
All right. Were there any other questions? I think from that last part, you said $500 for that incident per hour to fix it. We know it's expensive to get the right system in place, but if you do get hacked in, I presume it would have been much easier to pay to prevent it than to have the issues of getting all your data back. With no other.
Yeah, oh, go
ahead.
The old saying with, you know, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, right? So, and again, that's why the NIST CSF has all, you know, most of your eggs on the recovery, on the identify and protect side of the basket. We want to prevent it from happening, you know, in the first place. But yeah, I mean, if you don't do any of those things and then you get, you know, infected, I mean, the fact is, small businesses, if they have a massive breach, a lot of them just go out of business. They don't recover at all.
All right, we are happy to connect anyone that wants to learn more from Jason. We are going to share the presentation in the coming days, so you can look for that and follow Jason's advice. June 2nd is our next Manufacturing Matters presentation. We are partnered with the World Trade Center on this one. It is called The Global Supply Chain is Fracturing, What Can You Do? It's been presented around the state, and we brought it to our region because it's been so widely popular, because things change in China, and we're going to have more reshoring. So it'll be very interesting to hear. We'll include that in the follow-up email as well, or you can go to mantech.org and find that on June 2nd training. So thank you everyone for attending, and we'll see you in the future.
Thank you.